Welcome back. This is week 5, lecture 2, The Fall of Rome. Now, the fall of Rome is a problem. I'll explain why that's the case as we go through this lecture. But it has become so much a part of our understanding of Rome that it's something that needs to be addressed. I mean, even the textbook states that the fall of Rome, or Rome fell in 476. But we have to question how and why that was the case. When we look at it historically, in the sources, there's no indications of a so-called fall of Rome. The term, the fall of Rome, comes from the work of Edward Gibbon, a British historian of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, who in 1776, that great year, published the first volume of what would be a 5-volume study with the title, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon has set that in our consciousness ever since. It's an historiographical term, not an historical term. And this is one of the problems that I think I've tried to address, especially in the earlier lectures, in terms of the relationship between what historians write and then our understanding of the past, and how what historians write and the terms that we use to describe the past affects how we understand the past. There was no discussion of the fall of Rome before Gibbon. But since Gibbon, it's just accepted as the basic part of the history of Rome and the Roman Empire. Now, one of the arguments that Gibbon made, and obviously trying to reduce 5 volumes into a single thesis is difficult, but one of the arguments that Gibbon made was that Rome fell because it became Christian. Now, Gibbon himself was a Christian, so he's not trying to undermine Christianity. I mean, he was an Enlightenment figure and thinker. And if you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. You will certainly learn about it in the second part of this course, H114. But in general, the Enlightenment was, I'm not going to say against Christianity, because it wasn't, even if it's been portrayed in that terms, but it was certainly focused on reason and rationality. But that's a whole nother issue. And I'm not going to spend my time right now talking to you about the Enlightenment and my views of it, etc. But the point here is that Gibbon viewed the transformation of Rome as being part of the impact of Rome becoming Christian, which now I've talked about in previous lectures in terms of both the rise of Christianity and then also with Augustine of Hippo. Now, this lecture, as if you look at the PowerPoint slides for this lecture, repeats some of that information that I've already covered in those 2 previous lectures. I'm not going to go and do the whole thing again, but I just want to remind you of some of those issues. So the question we need to bring to this lecture is, did Rome fall? And if Rome fell, how and why did it fall? And Gibbon's arguments was that Christianity was an inherently anti-Roman belief system. That instead of this idea of conquering and virtue and this sense of Roman, pietas, as I said, but it's a very different view of pietas that really undermined Roman values. Now, I think I said before that the Romans thought Christianity undermined good Roman ethics and values. And I went through why that was the case. So Gibbon's point was not to argue against Christianity, but just to look at how a culture that was in some ways, I'm not going to say completely unified, because by the time we get to the 4th on into the 5th century, Rome was so expansive there was no unified culture, but just, let's say, an ideological system, a view of what we are as Romans. And by adopting Christianity, they adopted, let's say, a foreign ethic, a foreign way of thought. And that undermined the very essence of what made Rome Rome. Now, I'm not saying that was the case in any way, shape, or form. I mean, there's been so many different theories in terms of why Rome, quote unquote, fell. One was being that they had extra amounts of lead in the water, and so they were all suffering from lead poisoning. That's pretty ridiculous, but still, let's put it out there because this empire, as an empire form of government, had lasted since 27 BCE with the establishment of the Principate by Caesar Augustus, or by Octavian, becoming hailed as Caesar Augustus, which I've already talked about. And if we look at it from the history of Rome itself, it had been an empire since at least the 3rd century BCE, if not the 2nd century BCE. And so it's like the Roman Empire had lasted so long. And that astounded people. And so to talk about the fall of Rome is a very impactful concept on our understanding of the whole history of Rome. And so to come back and say, okay, well, if Gibbon was quote unquote wrong, now there's insights there. It's not necessarily right or wrong. But if Rome never fell, how are we to understand this period? And how are we to understand the events that Gibbon used to describe what he called the fall of Rome? It was a fall of an ideal, fall of a myth. And yet, as I won't be arguing, the myth of Rome still remained long after it, quote unquote, fell, if it ever really did. So that's kind of the context for this lecture. It's a way of wrapping things up and preparing for the midterm, which is coming next. So next week, next lecture is simply helping you prepare for the midterm. This is the workshop in terms of test-taking skills or essay writing skills or whatever. But I'll be dealing with that next week. So that's what this is all about, kind of wrapping up this whole first part of the course and looking at the development of Rome and then what happens to it. Because it does go through a transformation. That's what we're looking at. What was this transformation from, let's say, 300 to 600? Because by 300, we're still in this period of late antique Roman Empire. By 600 in the West, things have changed radically. How did we get there? That's kind of the frame for this lecture. Now, here we go. And I start by just reminding all of us of this 4th century, the 300s, and what happened during this amazing century, because it was an amazing century. This is the century during which Christianity went from being an illegal, persecuted religion to becoming the only legal religion of Rome. Now, what I don't think I've said this in the lecture on the rise of Christianity when I was talking more specifically about this issue. It would be as if the United States, within the next 50 to 75 years, became officially an Islamic state. Now, some of you might laugh at that as a possibility. Some of you might say, yeah, well, we're heading in that direction. Some of you might dismiss that as just pure speculation. But the point is, no one at this point in time, or very few people, unless they're trying to make a political point or putting forth conspiracy theories, really thinks that the United States is going to become an Islamic state in the near, quote unquote, near future. The Romans never thought that about Christianity, that they would become a Christian state. But that's what they did. Now, I previously mentioned the importance of Diocletian and how Diocletian instigated the Great Persecution in 303 BCE, or excuse me, CE, to rid the world of Christianity. That failed, and he abdicated in 305, and the political posturing in terms of the tetrarchy that Diocletian had established for who then would take over as the Augustus in the west, the Augustus in the east, and the new Caesars, eventually led to the emergence of Constantine. Now, Constantine was a major figure in so many ways, not only for the time, but for the entire development of the West from his time that he became the emperor and from thereafter. Because number one, and here I have 3 points of the impact of Constantine and what he achieved. He reunited the empire after the Tetrarchy. He reunited the empire eventually under his own rule and singly under his own rule. There was no longer this division between East and West that Diocletian had set up with the Tetrarchy. It was all back in some ways as it always had been, with under his authority, under his rule. And doing that, then he realized that he had to deal with the Christianity problem. He'd already proclaimed in 313 in the Edict of Milan Christianity as a legal religion, so it could no longer be persecuted. It was no longer a crime to be Christian, and that was an important step. But then he said, okay, but now what? How do we do it? And what really is Christianity? Because there are different views of it. And Constantine set about putting his own house in order, so to speak. Now, it's often been claimed that he became a Christian. At that point, he didn't. Depending on what we mean by this, he wasn't baptized until basically on his deathbed. And I think, as I mentioned in the lecture on the rise of Christianity, he still appealed to the sun god and traditional Roman religion. He still used the term Sol Invictus in his writings. So he still has that sense of this Christianity is another legitimate religion, and it's a religion that had helped him win the emperorship. It helped him win Rome, and so he's favoring Rome, not to the exclusion of traditional Roman religion, but as, let's say, a privileged Roman religion at this point. He says, okay, but what then is it about Christianity? What do they believe? There's different views of it. And he calls the Council of Constance, not Council of Constance, Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. And the Council of Nicaea is a foundational church council for the Christianity for the rest of the development of Christianity. It's still on today. So what do they do at the Council of Nicaea? And I have up here 3 points. Condemnation of Arianism, the Nicene Creed, and the setting the canon. Arianism, I think I addressed this, was an option at the time. It was a position of who was Jesus of Nazareth. That had been debated almost since the crucifixion itself, or even before, with the beginning of Jesus's preaching and public mission. And it was debated. Is this truly the Son of God? Is this truly the Messiah? Or is this someone that is just another crackpot? And in some ways, not in all ways, but in some ways, the gospel stories show that there was not a unified understanding of Jesus. And then with the writings of Paul, we even have further descriptions of this person, who this person was, in terms of what does it all mean. And we're supposed to, as Christians, with Paul, first letters to the Corinthians gives us the Eucharistic formulation in terms of do this in remembrance of me. So they're celebrating. It becomes the very basis of worship, this figure of Jesus of Nazareth. Who was he? Was he, a human being that became divine, that was adopted as the Son of God, which was understandable? After all, Julius Caesar had been proclaimed divine, and then Caesar Augustus, Octavian, had then, based on his relationship to Caesar, had proclaimed himself as the son of a god. There were other cases in the ancient world, people becoming divinized and becoming divine. Also, we can go back to the Epic of Gilgamesh and Hammurabi with Utnashpatim having become divine. So that was a very acceptable view. But that's not what became the Orthodox view. The Orthodox view that Jesus of Nazareth was the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity. Now, none of that is in the Bible. There is no place in the Bible that talks about Jesus as the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity. To make that formulation, you need Greek philosophy, because the term that was used at the Council of Nicaea to describe who was Jesus of Nazareth was homoousion, a Greek term which means of one being. And the Nicene Creed states one being with the Father, through whom all was made. Of one being with the Father. That is not a Jewish way of thought. That's a Greek way of thought. And even I can talk further about this with Paul when he, in the book of Acts, in the account when he is speaking before the Areopagus, he talks about, you Greeks, you know all these things that I'm going to tell you. And he started talking about the logos, because that's the Greek term. And the Greek term logos can mean many different things. It can mean, reason. It can mean word. It can mean the basic principle. And that the Greeks understood, because it's a Greek philosophical term, logos. And Paul then, and they were with him. They were listening to him and kind of following him. And then when he said that the logos became flesh, that's when they said, "Oh, you're crazy." So the whole point is that this defining of Christian belief, defining who was Jesus of Nazareth, and defining Christian doctrine was only possible based on the adoption of Greek thought, Greek philosophical thought. And that is what comes about in the Council of Nicaea. It condemns Arianism, the position that Jesus was the adopted Son of God, that Jesus was a human being that became divinized, became immortal. And it argues very strongly for the pre-existence of Jesus of Nazareth, who was always one being with the Father. So this whole issue of incarnation, of becoming flesh, the Word becoming flesh, becoming human, was problematic, because another position that I don't address there, but that was very prevalent, was that Jesus didn't really become human. He just appeared as human. That too was a very acceptable option. After all, the Greek gods are not humans, but they appear as humans. They can appear as different other things too, as we know with Zeus appearing as the bull to snatch away Europa. And so there's this issue of, is this just an appearance of being human? So is he this divine being that then appears in the form of a human being? Or was he really human? So it becomes a very difficult question and issue. And Nicaea set the precedence, because one of the things that Constantine said, okay, we need to have a clear statement of faith so we can condemn Arianism, but what is it then that we do believe? And the Nicene Creed was that statement. Creed means, it comes from the Latin credo, credere, to believe. So the Nicene Creed is the basic fundamental statement of Christian faith, Christian belief. That was important. Now, it's not to say that there were other creeds. There was what's been known as the Apostles' Creed. But the Nicene Creed became the accepted fundamental definition of the foundation of what Christianity was. So if you don't adhere to the Nicene Creed, you can't really be Christian. And that took place, it came about at the Council of Nicaea under the leadership of Constantine. And that is going to be incredibly important, the role of the emperor within Christianity in the defining of doctrine. But that will be for later, so to speak. But another thing that the Council of Nicaea did was to set the canon, meaning what are the books, what are the writings that will be the official scripture for Christianity, that serve as the basis for theological definitions and for theological beliefs, as this body of ideas is spreading. What is the basis for it? That is revelation, because the claim was that God had revealed God's self in the Christian writings. But there were different Christian writings running around. Now, they accepted the Hebrew Bible, and that was a question too. In the 3rd century CE, one of the major figures was a person by the name of Marcion, and he claimed that we shouldn't deal with the Jewish Bible. That's old. We should just look at what became known as the New Testament writings, the Christian writings. And so for Marcion, let's forget the whole Jewish background. That position was condemned. But still here, there were other gospels circulating. There were other stories of Jesus circulating. Are there letters being circulated? What are genuine and what aren't, and what was really quote unquote revelation? And the Council of Nicaea came up with a list of the books that became the books of the Bible, because the term Biblia in Latin simply means library. It means books, from biblios in Greek. And so it's a collection of books, a collection of writings that becomes then set as these are the official writings that are determined as a whole. That's the canon. That's what it kind of means to be established as divine revelation. Now, there'd be debates continuing over particular writings. Does Revelation really belong in there or not? And when we get there, perhaps I'll try to remember that Luther questioned the letter of James, called it the letter of straw, wanted to get rid of it from the canon. So there are still edges of controversy or potential controversy, but at least there's the core that's set there in Nicaea.